began with just a quiet signature in a nondescript office, unleashing a collapse that ripped across the American heartland like wildfire. Overnight, $14 billion in farm exports were left exposed. Silos brimming with hope turned into dead weight. Tractors sat idle, humming into silence. This wasn't a market dip, it was a gutting of the backbone of America, triggered not by drought, not by storms, but by the very policies meant to protect them. What turned loyal farmers into casualties overnight? Why are new superpowers moving in to take everything they built? Why are China, Brazil, and Europe now reaping the rewards while America's fields fall silent? And is there any way back, or is the collapse already too far gone? Stay locked in, because by the end of this video, you will not just see the farm crisis. You will understand why your wallet, your table, and your future are next in line. Prices on pause. Inside the grain pits, the board flickered green and red with quiet, uneventful trade. Corn futures inched a fraction of a percent. Soybeans danced, then settled. It was the kind of movement that made seasoned traders sip their coffee a little slower, but not change their lunch plan. On the surface, the market appeared stable, almost indifferent to the memo gathering dust in Washington. Yet appearances are deceiving. Futures markets reflect not the present, but faith in the future. What was playing out was not confidence, it was paralysis. Contracts for export to China still sat on the books. Barges were still scheduled. Money had already been sunk into seed, fertilizer, equipment leases. From the outside, all seemed calm. Beneath, the rot had begun. It took only a single canceled contract to break the illusion. 2 million bushels of soybeans, destined for Shanghai, were declined without ceremony. The trader who handled the notice swore under his breath, aware that this was not an isolated storm. It was the first flake of an avalanche. But in the world of farming, a still market is never a quiet one. And when the first contracts began to vanish, the silence turned deadly. China's cold shoulder. On a worn patch of land outside Des Moines, the Jensen family pulled into their grain lot before sunrise. The bins were full, the moisture sensors blinking steadily in the dim light. They had contracts lined up for months. They had done everything right, carefully timing the harvest, hedging against drought, investing in new equipment to maximize yield. Then, without warning, the calls stopped coming. By noon, rumors had spread like wildfire across the county. China, their biggest customer, had walked away. 20 contracts canceled in a single week. $500 million worth of soybeans that now had no home, no buyers, no promises. The Jensens stood by their silent augers, watching the dust settle over their bins. Each grain now a reminder of a handshake deal shattered by forces far beyond their control. It was not just money they lost that day, it was trust. Trust in the system that had allowed 3 generations to build a farm out of stubborn soil, hard winters, and pure hope. Trust in markets that once stretched across oceans. The empty echo inside their storage sheds was louder than any press release or announcement coming out of Washington. It was the sound of an empire quietly beginning to falter. Half a state away, elevator manager Carla Reyes unlocked the gates to her grain facility and stood alone in the driveway, waiting for the trucks that never came. Morning slipped into afternoon, and the lot remained barren. The scale house phone silent. Drivers she had seen every week for years were suddenly nowhere to be found, their routes erased by cancellations and chaos. What unfolded next stretched far beyond missed shipments. It wasn't just rural families who felt the shock. It began to hollow out the very markets that had made American agriculture a global titan. Echoes of a ghost market. Along the battered docks of Chicago's port, a single barge floated against the wharf, its rusted hull groaning in the river wind. Inside, the cargo hold gaped empty, the concrete loading ramps gathering dust. Only weeks earlier, this spot would have been crammed with pallets and containers, workers hustling to fill quotas for eager overseas buyers. Now the cranes stood idle, swaying gently in the gray morning mist like forgotten monuments to another time. A 10% drop in grain exports loomed over national forecasts like a winter storm cloud refusing to move. Analysts warned quietly, almost apologetically. American agriculture was in retreat, even if the headlines hadn't caught up yet. Every canceled contract nudged the numbers lower. Every delayed shipment pushed desperate farmers closer to the brink. Across the Atlantic, other ports were rising to take America's place. New trade deals were being inked in cold conference rooms thousands of miles away. Deals that no longer counted on Midwestern grain. New suppliers emerged from South America, Eastern Europe, even parts of Africa, ready to step into the vacuum. Back on the docks, the terminal supervisor checked his watch, sighed, and made another empty entry in his battered ledger. No new shipments, no trucks coming in, no ships going out. It felt like waiting for a train that had already been canceled, long after the station closed down. From the silent port of Chicago to the frozen fields of Minnesota, the damage was spreading faster than anyone dared admit. Not with storms or floods, but with contracts unmade, markets shifting in the dark, and a creeping realization the foundation had cracked and no one was coming to patch it back together. Across rural America, farmers locked their barn doors against a future suddenly far more uncertain than the weather and far more unforgiving. Bailout Illusion. The announcement came with all the bravado of a game show prize. $12 billion in emergency aid, they promised. Relief for farmers caught in the crossfire of trade wars. Senators posed for photographs, smiling as they described a lifeline being thrown across America's fields. In truth, that lifeline came tangled in red tape, and we dug through the collapse, tariffs, trade deals, even the silent takeover by corporate landowners to connect all the dots for you. Now you see why this isn't just about farmers. It's about the future sitting on your own table. If you got value from this, hit subscribe and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your take. After all of this, farmers, already battered by missed sales and rising costs, faced thick reams of paperwork, eligibility hurdles, and months-long delays. 55% of those who applied for bailout money waited more than 90 days just for a partial check. Others were denied for arbitrary reasons. Wrong crop, wrong timing, wrong address. At the kitchen tables of America's Farm Belt, late at night under buzzing fluorescent lights, farmers hunched over endless forms, calculating, hoping, cursing. The money, when it came, was not enough to replace the lost contracts, the rising loan payments, or the yawning fear that next year would be worse. The checks papered over wounds, but they could not mend trust. A new seed had been planted deep in the heartland, suspicion. Not far from those quiet dining rooms, another blow was building, one they could not solve with paperwork or patience. Potash price shock. Out in South Dakota, the early spring shipments of fertilizer were already late when the first invoices landed. The co-op's managers stared in disbelief as the numbers doubled overnight. Potash, the essential mineral that feeds soybeans and corn, now cost $440 per ton, up from $220 barely a season ago. For a farmer working 1,000 acres, that meant an extra $50,000, an impossible sum to absorb when grain prices remained stagnant and markets unstable. Empty fertilizer bins clattered in the co-op yard, and the usual hum of pre-planting preparation fell eerily silent. Fertility plans were slashed. Fields that once yielded rich harvests would go underfed, forced to scrape nutrients from already depleted soil. Those who had applied potash last fall breathed easier. For the rest, the decision was brutal. Go deeper into debt to cover the rising costs, or gamble on leaner yields and pray for mercy from the weather gods. Meanwhile, just down the road, the struggle for survival took on an even sharper, more personal edge. Neighbors as competitors. In Lincoln County, Nebraska, a land auction drew every farmer for 50 miles. 80 acres, the kind of tract that could make or break a family's future, went under the hammer. Among the bidders stood two men who had shaken hands at church picnics and coached each other's sons in Little League. That afternoon, friendship dissolved under the heat of necessity. Bidding climbed higher than either had planned, each man knowing that if he did not win the lease, the other would, and if the other won, he would be stronger next season, better able to outbid again. When the gavel finally slammed down, one man left victorious but hollow-eyed. The other walked away empty-handed, staring at the dust that clung to his boots. The taste of betrayal lingered longer than the dust. Out here, no one used the word enemy, but in the tight-knit rural communities where every loan officer knew your yield by heart, the air grew thick with silent rivalries. The pressures pushing neighbors against each other were not natural. They were manufactured, calibrated by forces hundreds of miles away. And those forces were about to squeeze even harder. Loans that never sleep. Inside a quiet bank office in Martin County, a loan officer tapped the screen of his computer, watching the figures inch upward. A $200,000 loan for a combine, signed back when markets were stable, now loomed large. Interest accumulated every day the machine sat idle, each unpaid cent stacking invisibly atop the farmer's already shaky balance sheet. At an 8% interest rate, that loan would balloon by more than $40,000 if left untouched. That was no longer a possibility. It was already happening. Many farmers faced a grim reality. The machines they needed to plant and harvest their fields were becoming anchors, dragging their finances into deeper water. The clatter of the bank's old adding machine echoed through the office, counting out futures that looked grimmer by the hour. There were fewer refinancing options now. Land that once served as collateral had lost value along with the global markets. Meanwhile, in farmhouses and pickup trucks across the plains, farmers worked longer hours for thinner margins, praying their crop insurance would be enough, wondering if another season of short sales would leave them still standing. Beyond the co-ops, auctions, and bank offices, a different kind of risk was brewing, tied to promises of green energy that now looked increasingly like mirages shimmering over dry, cracked soil. Ethanol's empty promise, the whine of machinery, had once been the heartbeat of a thriving ethanol plant on the edge of Mason City, Iowa. By February, the gates were padlocked. 9 plants across the Midwest shared the same fate, leaving behind acres of rusting tanks and pipelines that had once pumped liquid energy from corn kernels. The promise of ethanol, the great hope that had stitched farming to America's energy independence, was beginning to unravel. With the drop in global oil prices and a weakened international market, demand for ethanol shrank by 5% almost overnight. In practical terms, that meant 300 million bushels of corn had no buyers, no market, and no future except to sit in storage until it spoiled or sank the farmers who grew it. Inside the silent Mason City plant, the faint smell of fermented mash still hung in the air, a ghost of bushels that had once raced toward prosperity. Conveyor belts stood still under layers of dust. Workers had been sent home weeks ago, each carrying with them the weight of broken promises. From the perspective of Washington policymakers, it was just a minor adjustment in the energy portfolio. From the view of rural America, it was a lifeline, severed without warning. The corn was still there. The debts tied to planting it were still there. What vanished was the market, the hope, the belief that investing in sustainable energy had been a smart gamble. The silence in Mason City was only the beginning. The damage rippled outward to the farmers who had built their future on loyalty and long-term bets, and who now found themselves paying the highest price, loyalty's hidden toll. On a cold March morning, the Mitchell family locked the front door of their farmhouse for the last time. A battered pickup, its bed loaded with battered furniture and seed-stained boots, idled in the driveway. Taped to the windshield was a letter addressed to no one and everyone. We voted for change. We lost our land. We lost our future. We are not angry. We are heartbroken. 3 generations had worked those fields. They had planted corn through dust storms, harvested soybeans through torrential rain, survived droughts that cracked the earth like pottery. Yet they could not survive the collapse of the markets that once sustained them. It was not betrayal by nature or by God. It was betrayal by policy, by decisions made thousands of miles away that transformed tariffs from bargaining chips into weapons turned against their own citizens. The Mitchells had not expected wealth. They had not even expected ease. All they had asked for was a fair chance to compete. What they received was silence from buyers, soaring costs from suppliers, and indifference from the policymakers who had once promised salvation. They drove away that morning without ceremony, past fields that would soon go unplanted, past neighbors who dared not meet their eye, afraid of seeing their own future reflected back at them. Far beyond that dusty lane, auction blocks were filling with the evidence of failure. Auction block reality. At county fairgrounds once reserved for summer festivals and rodeos, auctioneers now barked over rows of tractors, planters, sprayers, and seed tenders. The aroma of funnel cakes and barbecue had been replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of desperation. Across the Midwest, the rate of farm asset auctions surged by 40% compared to the previous year. Over 1,200 farms had been sold off by the onset of autumn, double the losses recorded 2 harvests ago. Each sale was more than a transaction. It was the liquidation of dreams, of decades of sweat invested into land that could no longer sustain its owners. The clatter of the auctioneer's gavel rang out again and again, marking the end of an era with each final bid. Buyers circled like vultures, many from corporations and conglomerates, snapping up distressed properties to feed larger industrial farms or speculative portfolios. Behind each sale was a story of a family forced to make impossible choices. Sell now, lose everything quietly. Hold out and face foreclosure with public shame. The result was the same. Fewer independent farmers, more absentee landlords, and a hollowing out of communities already teetering on the edge. Yet amid this despair, a quiet defiance stirred. Some farmers, determined to cling to the soil that had defined them, turned to the oldest lesson the land had to offer: survival through renewal. Breathing dust again. On a windswept plain outside Salina, Kansas, a group group of farmers bent to the earth with spades and seedlings. They were not planting corn, they were planting hope, rows of willow, pine, and silver maple, the building blocks of shelter belts meant to shield their fragile topsoil from the ravages of wind. The lessons of the Dust Bowl had never entirely faded from memory, but now they surged back with brutal clarity. Where large agribusinesses chased quarterly profits with monocultures and relentless tillage, these farmers chose another path: to heal the land, to rebuild resilience one tree at a time. Shelter belts could reduce soil erosion by as much as 75%, according to environmental studies. They offered no quick profit, demanded patience, and yielded dividends measured in decades rather than seasons. Yet they embodied a stubborn refusal to surrender entirely to forces beyond their control. The work was slow and painstaking. Branches snapped in the fierce prairie winds. Dust stung eyes and lodged in throats. The tractors hauling water tanks for irrigation strained over uneven fields. Still, every planted sapling was a vote of confidence that the land could be saved, that the story of American farming need not end in a cloud of dust and regret. From Mason City's abandoned ethanol tanks to Selena's hopeful shelter belts, the path forward lay not in waiting for rescue from distant capitals, but in rewriting the very rules by which rural America lived. The question now was whether that spirit of renewal could survive what was coming next. Not just economic collapse, but the arrival of a new competitor whose rise would redraw the global agricultural map forever: the Brazilian surge. At first, it seemed like a distant rumor. Brazil expanding its soybean footprint. A few extra fields, maybe a few new export contracts. Nothing to worry about, farmers in Kansas told themselves. Nothing to fear, whispered farmers in Iowa. Yet as seasons passed, the rumor grew legs. And then it grew wings. Across the vast plateaus of Mato Grosso and Goiás, new farms rose overnight like cities built from red dust and ambition. It was not just expansion, it was a transformation. Brazilian soy production jumped by over 20 million metric tons within 2 harvest cycles. Entire river systems were dredged to create new shipping lanes. Chinese-backed financing paved new highways straight from farm to port. Brazil was not reacting to the trade war, it was conquering it. Inside the export terminals of Paranaguá, carriers the size of skyscrapers loaded up with grain once destined for American ports. The ships steamed west across the Pacific, bypassing the silos of Duluth, the trains of Omaha, the barges of New Orleans. For American farmers, this was not just lost sales. It was lost leverage, lost identity. They were no longer the world's breadbasket. They were becoming a backup plan. The worst part? No tariffs, no subsidies. No bailout could turn back time. Back home on the brittle plains of the Dakotas, the ground itself seemed to mirror the despair, cracking in the summer sun, surrendering to winds that no longer brought prosperity, only dust. The rise of ghost towns. Under the faded banners of abandoned county fairs, silence reigned. Where once there had been tractor pulls and fried dough stands, there were only empty bleachers and rattling concession windows. High school football fields, once the pride of 1,000 Friday nights, stood dark under broken floodlights. Local banks turned into antique shops. Antique shops turned into boarded-up shells. In Howard County, Nebraska, 2/3 of businesses shuttered in less than 5 years. Empty storefronts multiplied faster than weeds in an untended field. The average age of the remaining population climbed past 58, with more funerals than baptisms filling church calendars. Every lost farm pulled the town closer to the edge. A tractor dealership that once employed 50 men now had 3 mechanics left, rotating skeleton shifts. Grocery stores closed down, forcing residents to drive 2 hours just to buy milk and bread. Real estate prices collapsed, making land cheap for outsiders, but impossible to sell for those still clinging to home. With each passing season, the emotional toll deepened. The coffee shop regulars disappeared. The county fair queens packed their crowns into attic boxes, relics of better times. For those who stayed behind, the hardest part was not the empty streets. It was the knowledge that their way of life was disappearing, and nobody outside these fading towns seemed to notice. And when they looked out across the vacant fields, a deeper fear gnawed at them. Not just who would farm this land, but whether anyone ever would again. Land without farmers. The new owners did not come with muddy boots or seed caps. They arrived with briefcases, spreadsheets, and limited liability corporations. Their hands had never touched a cornstalk, and their names never appeared on a Harvest Festival poster. They came from New York City boardrooms, from global pension funds, from places where land was just another line item on a portfolio. By 2024, nearly 30% of American farmland was under corporate ownership. In states like Illinois and Indiana, Indiana, absentee ownership rates climbed to nearly 40%. With no roots in the communities, the new landlords cared only for maximum yield at minimal cost. Chemical-intensive practices replaced soil stewardship. Tilled fields stretched unbroken for miles, indifferent to erosion or habitat loss. Water rights were squeezed for every drop, exhausting aquifers that had taken centuries to fill. Local grain elevators closed as corporate farms bypassed them for private deals. Co-ops collapsed under falling membership. Machinery dealerships, once bustling with service calls, now sold mainly to conglomerates who imported their own mechanics. Meanwhile, the children of displaced farm families scattered to the cities, taking with them generations of knowledge. Knowledge about drought cycles, about the way corn plants lean before a storm, about which ridge would frost first on an autumn night. What grew in their place was not just crops, but a system, a cold, efficient machine that treated the soil like a consumable, the workers like replaceable parts, and the communities as acceptable collateral damage. Amid that devastation, some stubborn sparks still flickered in the darkness. The last stand. In a dusty church basement near Red Oak, Iowa, the meeting began with coffee poured from cracked carafe and the kind of quiet hope only desperation can summon. A handful of farmers, their boots still caked with the dust of their ancestors' fields, leaned over folding tables strewn with seed catalogs, grant applications, and hand-drawn co-op plans. They were not there to reminisce. They were there to survive. Ideas flew across the room, starting their own food hubs to sell direct to urban consumers, rebuilding cooperative grain elevators, creating shared equipment pools to cut costs, transitioning acreage to regenerative agriculture and heirloom varieties that did not depend on corporate inputs. It would not be easy. It would not be quick. Many would fail. But each plan, each sketch, each handshake was a defiant shout against the silence creeping over the land. They spoke of no longer chasing the commodity markets. They spoke of resilience instead of scale, of stewardship instead of extraction, of staying when the world told them to go. Outside, the winter wind rattled the old stained glass windows. Somewhere far away, another ethanol plant closed. Another hedge fund bought another farm. Inside that basement, hope lived on, not as blind optimism, but as a grim determination carved into the bedrock of those who refused to become the last generation. As they filed out into the cold night, their pickups idling in the gravel lot, the stars overhead shone down on fields, still sleeping under a thin crust of frost. Tomorrow they would break ground not just on a new season, but on a new future. One written by those still stubborn enough to believe that the soil beneath their feet was more than just dirt. It was life itself, and it was worth fighting for. Think about it. Can small farmers truly rewrite their future? Or is the system too far gone? Would you stand and fight or walk away? Drop your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.